Pride Center here at Sacramento State. I am pleased to welcome you all to the event this evening. Before we get started with our events, we would like to take a moment to give honor and respect to the ancestors and to the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which we gather. Our campus operates on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Miwok, Wintu, Maidu, Nisenan, and Patwin Native peoples. We recognize the importance of acknowledging the original stewards of the land and ask that we consider our ancestors and our relationship to the land we are on. Please take a moment of silence with me. Thank you. At this time, I would like to bring onto the stage Dr. John Johnson, the Director of the Centers for Diversity and Inclusion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Good afternoon, good evening. The Centers for Diversity and Inclusion, in partnership with multiple units, departments, and programs on campus, coordinates the Green and Gold Speaker Series. This series features scholars, artists, writers, and thought leaders who offer valuable and unique contributions to our university's programming and intellectual landscape. The series takes its name from the university's colors because it is intended to reflect the sentiments expressed in our campus Statement of Diversity and Inclusion and our shared commitment to work collaboratively upon principles of cultural humility and respect for all to create an atmosphere in which a sense of belonging within our community can flourish. I would like to take this time to thank Professor Ayad Al-Kazaz for their generous support of this program, as well as the many units, departments, and individual faculty who helped to promote this event. Please join me in giving all of our supporters and collaborators a round of applause. We also have representatives from Sacramento State's Counseling and Psychological Services Office present to provide assistance and support should it be needed. Would Dr. Darren Smith please stand so people can see where you are? I don't know if the lights are down, but Darren is in the back, waving their hand. So I just wanted to offer a few quick points about the Q&A portion of tonight's event. There will be time for a brief Q&A period after Dr. Kaziz's remarks. All questions must be submitted using one of the 3x5 cards provided on your seats. There will be staff in the aisles during the Q&A portion of the program to collect your cards. Just hold up the card and someone will make their way to your row to collect your question. All of the audience questions will be shared with our speaker, but we may not be able to get to all of the submitted questions in tonight's Q&A session. We also want to remind everyone that this program is not designed to be a forum for debate. Only clarifying questions related to the content shared by the speaker or questions designed to solicit additional information related to the general topic of the lecture will be posed to the speaker. You also have a short evaluation on your chair, as well as a pen and hopefully a pencil or some kind of writing implement. Please take a moment to provide us with any feedback you have about this event as you leave. There will be staff collecting the completed evaluations in the rear as you leave. So at this time, I would like to invite Kristen Cairo, a student leader working with the Women's Resource Center, to the microphone to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Nazia Kazi.
Dr. Nazia Kazi is an author, commentator, and professor based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her work on Islamophobia and U.S. racism has appeared in Democracy Now! And the Chronicle of Higher Education. She has lectured internationally on the topic of American Islamophobia and state-sanctioned violence. She is currently an assistant professor of anthropology at Stockton University in New Jersey, where she teaches classes on race, migration, and U.S. empire. Her recent book, Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, explores the connections between anti-Muslim racism, white supremacy, and the U.S. foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nazia Kazi.
Say Allahu Akbar. Woohoo! Yeah.
A huge thank you to the Centers for Diversity and Inclusion for inviting me, Dr. John Johnson, Kristen for that lovely introduction. Thanks to all the staff behind the scenes who made this event possible, the faculty and students and community members who are here this evening, to think about these pretty tough issues, U.S. empire, Islamophobia, and American racism. So today I'm going to be sharing some reflections that I discuss in greater depth in my book on Islamophobia. Now, as I was writing this book, I heard that the officer who had murdered Philando Castile was cleared of all charges by a jury. A jury that had seen video footage of Castile's death. A jury that had seen Castile calmly tell the officer that he has a legally registered firearm. A jury that had heard the officer say, "Don't reach for it," had heard Castile respond, "I'm not," and then was promptly shot dead. Now, to me, it doesn't matter that Philando Castile was beloved in his community, because he most certainly was. It doesn't matter to me that Philando Castile memorized the allergies of the students he served in the lunchroom, which he did. It doesn't matter to me that when the kids were short on cash, he helped them pay for his lunches, which he also did. You see, I don't need evidence of Philando Castile's humanity, of his goodness, which it seems he had in huge measure. What does matter to me is that the state, once again, got away with murder. What does matter to me is that this type of violence is so normal, so commonplace in the US, that a jury would see this evidence and still acquit the officer. There were also no criminal charges brought in the death of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. He was killed after he accidentally pushed the button on his life alert medical device. In a recording of the killing, we hear the officer using racial slurs against Chamberlain before shooting him dead. Okay, so you might be wondering why I'm talking about Philando Castile and Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., both black men, in a talk on Islamophobia. You might wonder what the deaths of Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Oscar Grant, names I hope you are familiar with. You might ask what they have to do with today's discussion on anti-Muslim racism. And here's my answer. Rage. Rage forced me to write this book. Rage at all forms of state-sanctioned violence. And rage at white supremacy. You see, in my book, I show that it was white supremacy that left more than 1 million Iraqis dead after the US-led invasion. It was white supremacy that saw Mexican Americans lynched in the American Southwest, lynched for the crime of celebrating a Mexican holiday, lynched for speaking Spanish. And if you think that what's been happening to immigrants the last few months, children's in cages, families separated, if you think that it's somehow out of the ordinary, if you think Trump's treatment of immigrants is un-American, I'd like to know which version of American history you've read. Now, I'm really lucky. I get to spend my time in the university classroom with students, teaching about race and Islamophobia in the US. And sometimes I witness firsthand the very first time a student encounters, deep in their gut, the wrenching reality of America's racial history. Once I was teaching and something surprising happened. I was showing a film called Harvest of Empire A History of Latinos in America. And if you haven't seen it, screen it on campus, or better yet, read the book it's based on. The film asks why Latin Americans come to the US, some of them legally, others undocumented. And I'm showing the film, and the section began that described the support that the US gave to a brutal dictator in the Dominican Republic, a dictator by the name of Rafael Trujillo. The film discusses the tortures, executions, and rapes that were part of Trujillo's rule. And I looked out at my students and I saw one wipe a tear from her cheek. She was horrified. She was horrified at his brutality and horrified at the fact that the US had supported it. And in that moment, I kind of hated myself. I cursed myself because I had taken this history, this violent history, this history of the US destabilizing governments across Latin America, and I just thrown it in the face of my student. I had been so cavalier. I hadn't thought that a student might have a deep, human, emotional reaction, as well she should. Indeed, there is a deep painfulness, a troubling painfulness that comes with confronting that American history that doesn't make it into your social studies textbooks. So, let's go back to the question of immigrants. Many Americans, many liberal Americans, say that the US ought to welcome immigrants. It's the right thing to do. America is a land of immigrants, we're told. It was built and made beautiful because of its openness to new arrivals. We can call this the dominant liberal narrative of immigrant inclusion. And it's memorialized in the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." This dominant narrative of inclusion would have us believe that immigrants come here fleeing something terrible and seeking something wonderful, that American dream. The dominant narrative tells us that welcoming them is the right thing to do. And then all too often, it stops right there. It stops short of asking why. Why do migrants seek a better life here? What are the political, economic, and environmental conditions that lead migrants here? Well, let's take a look at the Somali Muslim community of Minnesota. This is one of the largest Somali populations in the US. And a quick look at them, if you just glanced at them, you'd say, yes, they fled a war-torn African country. They came to Minnesota and they pursued that American dream. The dominant narrative would tell us that incorporating Somalis into America is one of our great strengths as a merciful and inclusive nation. But this misses something. This misses something crucial. It misses a whole history that exists between the US and Somalia. Now, Somalia has long been an area of strategic interest for the United States. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union were in fierce competition for regions that we call the Third World. And Somalia was one such region. And what your social studies books didn't tell you is that the US backed plenty of dictators during those Cold War years. For instance, Siad Barre in Somalia. Barre was known to carry out horrific torture. He would imprison people who protested his rule, and he did all of this with ample support from the United States. Well, then the Cold War ended, but the US remained interested in Somalia, now because of its oil reserves. It was in the 1990s that the US military went into Somalia, and we, the American people, were told that this was a humanitarian intervention. We were told the US was bringing relief to the Somalis, relief from poverty, relief from violence. We were told the US was there to alleviate hunger and remove corruption from the country of Somalia. But it was during this time that American soldiers were heard uttering, "The only good Somali is a dead Somali." And during a 1993 massacre in Mogadishu, Somali children were used as targets for US troops. And yes, liberals and conservatives, Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, were in favor of this assault. Nothing quite seems to bring our two political parties together quite like war. In fact, recently, in 2017, Trump asked Congress to approve a $50 billion increase in military spending. Republicans and Democrats alike agreed that this number was too low and came back with a counteroffer of an $80 billion increase. Now, the liberal argument that we should welcome migrants, like the Somali Muslims of Minnesota, because it's part of our values, because we ought to exercise mercy in the face of their persecution and poverty, that argument isn't just simplistic, it's dangerously false. It erases the fact that a powerful nation like ours does owe migrants a great deal. Back to that harvest of empire, when we consider how the US has played a hand in destabilizing, weakening, and impoverishing many of the places from which immigrants come, then the discussion about migrants takes on a whole new significance. Persistent US military intervention has left Somalia in the throes of dwindling life expectancy, skyrocketing infant mortality, and rampant warfare. Now, knowing this history, we see that the US doesn't need to welcome Somalis because we're a merciful land of immigrants. This has nothing to do with America's exceptional founding values, and everything to do with American complicity. Okay. January 2017. Donald Trump's executive order, the one that came to be known as the Muslim ban, has just been signed into law. Across the country, almost spontaneously, airports were packed with protesters rallying against the executive order. I was there at the Philadelphia International Airport. Thousands had gathered. Inside, near baggage claim, there was a mini protest, a smaller protest. A few hundred people inside the terminal were having a sit-in. The sit-in was different from the bigger protest that was happening outside the airport doors. Outside, the protesters stood obediently behind a police barricade. Inside, the protesters chanted, "The Fraternal Order of Police endorsed Donald Trump." Inside, one speaker said, "White liberals are scared of Donald Trump because he's about to make them know what it's always felt like to be black in America." His comments struck me. They struck me as a reminder that for the most marginalized, the most excluded, the most demonized in America's racial order, for them, the rise of Trump isn't shocking, and it certainly isn't un-American. It's just the America we've been marching toward all along. Building a wall at the US-Mexico border was a cornerstone in Trump's presidential campaign, and it remains a cornerstone of his presidency. And you've all seen these images of Trump rallies with the supporters eagerly chanting, "Build the wall." His promise to build that wall appealed to voters who are afraid that immigrants coming here are taking their jobs. His promise to build a wall appealed to voters who see these immigrants as the source of their economic troubles. Voters who believe the myth of immigrant criminality. His promise to build a wall appealed to voters who know very little about that harvest of empire, who know very little about the violence the US itself exported to so much of Latin America. So his promise to build a wall appealed to them, but it offended others. Civil rights advocates, liberals, immigrants, religious leaders, many of them found the notion of walling off the US to be stupid, offensive, and primitive. I've seen protest signs protesting the wall. They say, "Walls fall, always," or "Build a wall around Trump," or "Show me a 10-foot wall, I'll show you an 11-foot ladder." That's right. People have come out to support Trump's border wall, and people have come out to protest against it. But there's a problem here, right? And it's that the wall kind of already exists, and it has for a while. It's a fence, right? A barricade that runs along much of the Cali-Mexico border. Trump was promising to build a wall that those who came before him, Republican and Democrat alike, had already begun constructing. It was under President Bill Clinton that construction of that physical barrier began. As senator, Hillary Clinton voted in support of the Secure Fence Act of 2006. Where were the protest signs? Why weren't people chanting, "Walls must fall," or "No walls on stolen land"? Where were those signs when initial steps at militarizing and walling off our border? Where were they when those steps were being taken? Why only under Trump was there such widespread opposition? Or consider this. When George W. Bush announced the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, the anti-war movement was reawakened. As a young person, I was a college student at the time. It was my first time demonstrating in the streets of Chicago. My heart pounded as I stood among tens of thousands of people marching down Michigan Avenue, blocking traffic, shutting down roads, risking arrest. It seemed at the time that so many of us knew, especially those of us who read our history, we knew that this was an illegal, unjustifiable act of violence. By the way, just last week, I surveyed my undergrad students at Stockton. I wanted to know what they knew about 9/11. So this fall, incoming college-aged students are the first generation born after 9/11. So I wanted to know what they thought, especially since we keep saying never forget, never forget. I wondered just how much we remember and what we've forgotten as a nation. And I wasn't surprised to see so many of my students write that they thought Saddam Hussein had done 9/11. I mean, I guess that's what they tried to tell us in 2003 too. That Saddam Hussein, that Iraq, something that a nation that had nothing to do with 9/11 or any act of American terrorism, was somehow Muslim and Arab enough to be guilty. In the lounge of my dorm in 2003, I got into it with someone I knew about the Iraq War. Come on, he told me. We were attacked on 9/11. Any country would go to war. For him, for many Americans, it was enough to declare war on them. And they were simply Muslim and Arab enough to deserve it. The whole justification for invading Iraq in 2003 rested on some bizarre logics. Some thought the US needed to get Saddam, the brutal dictator, out of office to bring democracy to Iraq. They didn't seem to care much about the support the US has provided for dictators aplenty. They didn't seem to care about the US's support for Saddam Hussein for decades prior to that the US had been the reason he had climbed to power to begin with. Some believed the US should go to war to get those weapons of mass destruction, weapons that didn't exist. They didn't seem too bothered by the fact that the US itself had given Saddam Hussein chemical weapons during the 1980s. And let's not forget the deeper history, the history that stretches well before 2003. Who can forget the sanctions regime that starved 500,000 Iraqi children to death? Appearing on 60 Minutes, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked about these deaths. She said, "We think the price is worth it." Come 2008, those anti-war protesters, they were eager to see something change. They were eager to end the Bush-era's legacy of warfare, and Barack Obama's campaign promised hope, change, and many thought he would bring a future that wasn't so militaristic, so aggressive. The campaign promises aside, what about Obama's presidential legacy? Well, Obama became the biggest military president the U.S. had seen until that point. He grew the U.S. war machine. He expanded the use of drone warfare, which has killed civilians in Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan. He endorsed extraordinary rendition. He created a kill list, a list that gives the president a power to assassinate anyone, even U.S. citizens, without judicial process. So he expanded the powers that are in the hands of the President of the United States, powers that now lie in the hands of Donald Trump. Where were the anti-war demonstrators? Where were those thousands who had poured out into the streets against Bush? Why weren't they ready to shut down the roads and wave those protest signs when war had a different face? In 2008, George W. Bush held a press conference in Iraq. During the press conference, an Iraqi journalist named Muntadhar al-Zaidi stood up, took off his shoes, and threw them directly at the US president. Bush ducked awkwardly. The incident went viral. It was hilarious. People cheered, laughed, replayed the footage. Around the world, al-Zaidi was hailed a hero. As he threw the second shoe, he shouted, "This is for the widows and orphans and those killed in Iraq. Bush would later say, "I didn't know what the guy's cause was." Zaidi was promptly arrested and imprisoned. That George W. Bush had been assaulted by an Iraqi man's shoes became a source of triumph, revenge, and belly laughs around the world. The late-night comedy shows feasted on it. But really, do we think al-Zaidi just threw his shoes at our goofy president? I think he threw them at Dick Cheney, the vice president. Cheney's company, Halliburton, made a mint off of the Iraq War. I think he threw them at Senators Clinton, Schumer, Biden, and Lieberman. I think he threw them at all those Democrats who had voted for the war. I think he threw them at the New York Times, that liberal paper that had misled the public into supporting the war. I think he threw them at Blackwater, whose CEO, Eric Prince, made a fortune off of the invasion of Iraq and has become a key player in the Trump administration. Maybe al-Zaidi threw his shoes at all of us, too, whose tax dollars paid for that war. Maybe he threw them at the US war machine in all its forms. So, this talk on Islamophobia has been all about foreign policy and global politics. Maybe you were expecting a lecture about Muslim women's hijabs being pulled off by strangers on public transportation. Because that happens a lot. Or maybe you wanted to hear about mosques being vandalized across the US, because that happens a lot too. You might have thought I'd stand up here and tell you about the years I've done of research on vandalism experienced by Muslim-owned restaurants, and how Muslim pedestrians are told, "Go home, terrorist," out of people who drive by. These things happen all the time, all too often. But there's a problem in American race politics. Here in the US, when we try to understand racism, we often take the most egregious forms of racism and see them as anomalies. We think in the US that racism is about bigotry and prejudice. We think racism exists in the hearts and minds of bigoted individuals. We think racism is about attitudes and perceptions, not institutions and systems. When Wade Michael Page carried out a massacre at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin in 2012, it was easy to call that an act of overt racism and hate. What about the face on our $20 bill? What about the poisoning of the water supply in Flint? What about the racism that is the kind of quiet backdrop to the acts of overt racists? You all remember the shooting at the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, yeah? Mm-hmm. Shortly after the attacks, an Australian politician named Senator Fraser Anning said that the true problem was immigration, which had allowed Muslims to immigrate. Oh, and on par with Bush getting hit by al-Zaidi's shoe is Fraser Anning getting hit over the head with an egg by a teenage boy. A boy who was so outraged by the racism of the senator in the aftermath of the Christchurch attack. So yes, we have to think about the hateful shooter and his massacre in New Zealand, but we have to think about Fraser Anning too. And we have to think about the indigenous people of Australia and New Zealand, whose land has been taken by settlers, indigenous people who were among the first to stand in solidarity with the Muslims of Christchurch. We have to think about the New Zealand shooter's manifesto, in which he said that he was inspired by the Great Replacement theory, a theory that comes from France, a theory that argues that immigrants and people of color are wiping out Europeans. We have to think about all the politicians who are inspired by the Great Replacement theory and are in office across Europe and increasingly across the US. So, I'm sorry I didn't give that talk, but it's because I want us to broaden our definition of Islamophobia. I want our definition of Islamophobia to include the sanctions the US passed that killed those 500,000 kids in Iraq. I want our definition of Islamophobia to include the menacing military bases on foreign soil. I want our definition of Islamophobia to include the American drone warfare program, a drone warfare program which has labeled all adult Muslim men enemy combatants rather than civilians. I want our definition of Islamophobia to include the support for monarchs in the Gulf states, monarchs who behead protesters and repress democracy in the Muslim world. So if we are even to begin to understand Islamophobia, we have to think beyond the actions of bigoted individuals. We have to push ourselves to ask, what inspired those bigoted individuals? What are the roots of their hate? And when we look there, we must not look away. For we will find that Islamophobia is all too often perpetrated by the state and paid for by our tax dollars. And we must push ourselves to see our own tragic and often invisible complicity. Thank you all.
Let's have another round of applause for Dr. Kazi. And if we can get the lights up a little bit, we want to give people an opportunity to ask some questions. We know you have some questions, and you should have pens or pencils and 3x5 cards that we'll have people collecting, and we'll submit these questions to Dr. Kazi to respond. So, hold up your cards. There we go. We got some cards.
We did this collection too.
I just put it up.
Ah.